Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. When a lonely mountain man finds a dying dog by the side of a dusty trail, he has no idea that sharing his last piece of bread will set off a chain of events that'll bring two broken souls together. Elijah Kane lives alone in the high country, carrying more pain than most men can bear. He finds a half-starved dog near Dry Creek Junction and shares his meager meal with her. What he don't know is that this dog belongs to Silas Hart, the richest cattleman in 3 counties, who's been searching everywhere for his beloved companion. Hart ain't just looking for a pet, he's trying to heal the one relationship that still matters to him. What happens when these two men's lives collide over the love of one faithful dog? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks like a shroud when Elijah Kane first laid eyes on the dying dog. He'd been walking these mountain trails for nigh on 7 years now, and in all that time, he'd learned to read the high country like scripture. Every bent branch, every disturbed stone, every track in the mud told a story. But this morning, near the old logging road that wound past Dry Creek Junction, the story was one of suffering. The dog lay sprawled in the muddy rut where the spring runoff had carved a channel, her ribs showing through matted fur like the slats of a broken fence. She was a border collie, or had been once, before hunger and hardship had whittled her down to bone and determination. Her black and white coat was filthy, caked with mud and burrs, and her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps that misted in the cold mountain air. Elijah stopped his steady pace and crouched down, his worn leather satchel creaking as it shifted on his shoulder. That satchel held everything he owned in this world: a few changes of clothes, a small pot for cooking, his grandfather's straight razor, and precious little else. A man could live with less, he'd learned. Sometimes a man had to. Well now, he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Days would pass sometimes without him speaking to another soul, and his words came out like rusty hinges. "What's a pretty girl like you doing in a place like this?" The dog's eyes, one brown, one blue, tracked to his face with an intelligence that struck him like a physical blow. She didn't try to move, didn't even lift her head, but something in those mismatched eyes spoke of dignity maintained despite suffering. Elijah had seen that look before, in the mirror during those first terrible months after he'd fled civilization. It was the look of a creature that had lost everything, but refused to lose itself. He reached into his satchel and pulled out the last of his cornbread, wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth. It wasn't much, maybe 3 bites for a grown man, but it was all he had until he could reach the trading post at Miller's Crossing, still a day's walk through the high passes. The sensible thing would be to save it, to husband his resources like any prudent man alone in the wilderness. Instead, he broke off a piece and held it near the dog's nose. "Come on, girl," he said softly. "Just a little something to keep your strength up." The dog's nostrils flared, and for a moment hope flickered in those remarkable eyes. She lifted her head just enough to take the offered morsel, her tongue rough and dry against his palm. She chewed slowly, carefully, as if she understood the gift for what it was. Elijah had built his life in these mountains around routine and solitude. He woke with the sun, walked the old game trails, set snares for rabbits, and gathered what the forest offered. He'd made peace with loneliness the way other men made peace with their wives, grudgingly at first, then with a kind of resigned affection. The silence up here didn't judge him. The peaks didn't whisper about his failures or point fingers at his shame. He'd chosen this life after everything went wrong down in the world below. After the night that changed everything, when all his medical training and desperate prayers couldn't save the one life that mattered most. The memories still came for him sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, but up here, among the granite and the wind, they seemed smaller somehow, more manageable. But now, looking down at this suffering creature, something stirred in his chest that he'd thought was long dead. Compassion, maybe, or just the simple human need to ease another's pain. "I reckon you've got a story," he told the dog, offering her another piece of cornbread. We all do up here. The mountains don't care what brought us, just whether we're strong enough to stay. He'd been strong enough, barely. Those first winters had nearly killed him, not from the cold or the hunger, but from the weight of carrying his guilt through the long, silent months. He'd learned to trap and hunt by trial and error, made mistakes that should have cost him his life, survived by luck and stubbornness and the gradual, understanding that sometimes a man had to break completely before he could build himself into something new. The dog finished the cornbread and looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude. Her tail, a bedraggled plume of mud-caked fur, managed a single weak wag. "That's it, girl," Elijah said, and before he could think better of it, he was scooping her up into his arms. She couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds, though he remembered when border collies were sturdy, substantial dogs. This one felt like a bird, all hollow bones and desperate courage. She didn't struggle or snap, just settled against his chest with a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and irregular against his ribs. "We'll get you sorted," he promised, though he wasn't sure how. His cabin was still hours away, a rough-hewn shelter he'd built into the lee of a granite outcropping near a reliable spring. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry, and it was his. The walk back took twice as long as usual. Elijah stopped frequently to rest, not from the dog's weight, but because he could feel her growing weaker with each mile. Her breathing became more labored, and twice he thought he'd lost her, only to feel that brave heart keep beating against his chest. The sun was high overhead when they finally reached his cabin, a simple structure of pine logs chinked with moss and mud. It looked like what it was, the work of a man who'd learned carpentry from necessity rather than skill. But the roof was sound, the walls kept out the wind, and the small stone fireplace drew well enough to keep the place warm through the brutal mountain winters. He laid the dog down on his own bed, a rough frame, strung with rope and topped with pine boughs and a wool blanket. She looked impossibly small against the dark wool, like a child lost in her father's coat. Elijah built up the fire and set water to warm in his single pot. He had no medical supplies to speak of. Those days were behind him, but he still remembered some things. Clean water, warmth, and time were still the best healers for most ailments. As the cabin warmed, he knelt beside the bed and began the careful work of cleaning the dog's matted fur. She lay still as stone, those mismatched eyes watching his every move with an intelligence that made his chest tighten. When he found the infected cuts on her paws, probably from running over rough ground, she whimpered once but didn't pull away. "I know it hurts," he murmured, his hands gentle as he cleaned the wounds with warm water. "But we'll get you fixed up proper." It was full dark outside when he finally finished. The dog's coat, cleaned of mud and burrs, revealed the true beauty beneath, a classic border collie pattern of black and white that spoke of careful breeding and gentle care. This wasn't some feral mountain dog. This was somebody's beloved companion, lost or abandoned in the high country. The thought should have worried him. Up here, ownership mattered. A man's dog was his property, protected by law and custom. But looking down at the peaceful face of the sleeping animal, Elijah found he didn't much care about the legal niceties. She'd been dying when he found her. Whatever her story, whoever had lost her, she was alive now because he'd chosen kindness over prudence. He settled into his chair by the fire, a rough-hewn seat he'd carved from a lightning-struck pine. The dog's breathing had steadied, and some color had returned to her gums. With food and rest, she might make it through the night. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending pine needles skittering across the roof. It was the sound of loneliness made audible, a song he'd grown accustomed to over the years. But tonight, with another living creature sharing his small sanctuary, the wind seemed less harsh somehow, less final. He dozed in his chair, waking periodically to check on his patient. Each time, those remarkable eyes would open and fix on his face, as if she were memorizing the features of the man who'd saved her life. There was trust there now, fragile but real. And it humbled him more than he cared to admit. In the deep hours before dawn, when the fire had burned low and the cabin was filled with gentle shadows, Elijah finally understood what he'd been missing all these years. Not the noise and bustle of civilization, not the hollow pleasures of his former life, but this, the simple grace of being needed by another soul. The dog slept on, her breathing deep and even, and for the first time in 7 years, Elijah Kane felt something like peace settle over his weathered heart. 3 days passed before Elijah discovered the silver collar hidden beneath the dog's matted neck fur. She'd been improving steadily, taking water and small bits of rabbit stew, lifting her head to watch him move about the cabin, even attempting to stand on shaky legs. He'd taken to calling her Mercy, partly for the grace she'd shown in accepting his help, and partly because mercy was something he understood better than most. On the morning of the 4th day, as he gently worked through a particularly stubborn tangle of fur behind her ears, his fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. At first, he thought it was just another burr, the kind that plagued every creature that spent time in the mountain brush. But as he worked the mat free, silver gleamed in the morning light, streaming through his single window. The collar was a thing of beauty, even tarnished and scratched as it was. Heavy silver links, each one hand-forged and polished to a mirror finish. It spoke of wealth and care, of someone who valued this animal enough to adorn her with precious metal. But it was the medallion hanging from the center that made Elijah's breath catch in his throat. Engraved in elegant script was a single name, Bell. Below it, in smaller letters, were the words Silas Hart Ranch and an address in cattle country, some 50 miles down the mountain toward the prairie. But it was the date that made his hands tremble, June 15th, 1885, for my darling Emily. With all my love, Papa, Emily. The name hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it memories he'd spent 7 years trying to forget. Emily Hart, the little girl with golden curls and laughing eyes who'd been brought to his surgery on a rain-soaked night in late autumn. The child he'd failed to save, despite every skill he possessed, every prayer he'd whispered to a God who seemed to have turned his face away. Elijah sank back on his heels, the collar heavy in his hands. Of all the dogs in all the mountains, fate had brought him this one, the beloved pet of the man whose daughter's death had destroyed his medical career and driven him into exile. The irony was so complete it felt orchestrated by some cruel cosmic intelligence. Mercy Bell watched him with those mismatched eyes, her head tilted slightly as if she could sense the turmoil rolling through him. She'd grown stronger over the past few days, enough to sit up and take notice of the world around her. Her coat, cleaned and brushed, revealed the careful breeding that had produced such a beautiful animal. This was no common farm dog, but a treasured companion, likely worth more than most men saw in a year. The memories came flooding back, despite his best efforts to hold them at bay. That terrible night when Silas Hart had burst through the doors of his surgery, his daughter's limp form cradled in his arms. She'd been thrown from her horse during a storm, struck her head on a rock. By the time they'd gotten her to town, precious time had been lost. Elijah had worked through the night, using every technique he'd learned in medical school back east, every procedure he'd mastered during his residency in Denver. But the damage had been too severe, the swelling in her brain too extensive. Little Emily Hart had slipped away just before dawn, her father's desperate pleas echoing in the small surgery room. The aftermath had been swift and brutal. Accusations of malpractice, whispers that he'd been drinking, suggestions that a more experienced doctor might have saved her. None of it had been true, but truth mattered little when a prominent man's child was dead and someone needed to bear the blame. Elijah's practice had crumbled within months, his reputation destroyed by grief-fueled gossip and the simple human need to assign fault to tragedy. He'd left town on a cold January morning, carrying nothing but his medical bag and the weight of failure that would follow him into the mountains. The bag was long gone now, traded to a desperate trapper for winter supplies during his 2nd year in exile. But the weight remained, a constant companion that had shaped every day of his hermit's existence. And now, impossibly, the past had found him in the form of a dying dog, wearing a silver collar that proclaimed her connection to the very man who'd lost everything because of Elijah's failure. "What am I supposed to do with you?" "Girl?" he whispered, running his thumb over the engraved name. "How can I keep you, knowing what I know?" Belle tilted her head the other way, then slowly, carefully rose to her feet. She was still unsteady, but the strength was returning to her legs. She took a tentative step toward him, then another, until she could rest her muzzle against his knee. The gesture was so trusting, so full of simple affection, that it nearly broke his heart. He knew what the right thing was. The moral thing. He should pack up what little gear he could carry, take Belle down the mountain to the Hart Ranch, and return her to her rightful owner. It would mean facing Silas Hart again, confronting the man whose life he'd helped destroy. It would mean explaining how he'd come to find the dog, where he'd been these past 7 years, why he'd chosen exile over fighting the accusations that had ruined him. But the thought of giving her up, of losing the first real companionship he'd known since fleeing to the mountains, felt like tearing away a piece of his soul. In just a few days, Belle had become more than a patient or a responsibility. She'd become hope, proof that he could still heal, still nurture, still be something more than a broken man hiding from his failures. He studied the collar more closely, noting details he'd missed in his initial shock. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each link perfectly formed and joined. The medallion bore tiny engravings around the edges, roses and ribbons that spoke of a father's love for his daughter. This wasn't just a dog collar, but a piece of jewelry, a treasure given with the kind of lavish affection that money could buy, but love made meaningful. The date told its own story. June 15th, 1885, likely Emily's birthday, though he couldn't remember the exact date from that terrible night 7 years ago. Silas Hart had commissioned this collar as a gift, probably presenting it to his daughter along with the puppy that would become her constant companion. The image was almost too painful to contemplate, a wealthy father indulging his beloved child, never imagining that both girl and dog would be lost to him before another year had passed. Belle nudged his hand with her nose, a gentle reminder that she was real and present and needed his attention. Her eyes held no knowledge of the tragedy that connected them, no understanding of the weight her very existence placed on his conscience. She knew only that he'd saved her life and continued to care for her with patience and kindness. "I reckon I could keep you a while longer," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just until you're stronger, just until you're ready to—" But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were lies. He wasn't keeping her for her own good, but for his own desperate need for companionship. He was being selfish, keeping something that belonged to another man simply because he couldn't bear to be alone again. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been trained in medical ethics and moral reasoning, insisted that ownership was clear and unambiguous. Belle belonged to Silas Hart, and every day he kept her was a day stolen from her rightful owner. The man was probably still searching, probably offering rewards, probably torturing himself with worry over the fate of his daughter's beloved pet. But the deeper part of him, the part that had been wounded and isolated for so long, argued back with desperate logic. He'd found her dying. He'd saved her life when anyone else might have passed by. Didn't that count for something? Didn't that create its own kind of bond, its own form of right? He slipped the collar into his pocket, unable to look at the engraved name any longer. Belle watched him with those remarkable mismatched eyes, trusting and patient. She had no way of knowing that her savior was also the man who'd failed to save her young mistress. No understanding of the bitter irony that had brought them together. "We'll figure it out," he told her, though he had no idea how. "Somehow, we'll figure out what's right." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin shutters and moaning through the pine boughs. It sounded like voices calling across the mountains, lost souls searching for something they'd never find. Elijah knew that sound well. He'd been making it himself for 7 long years, but now, with Belle pressed against his leg and her warm weight anchoring him to the present moment, the wind seemed less lonely somehow, less final. Maybe fate had brought them together for reasons he couldn't yet understand. Maybe this was his chance to do something right, to balance the scales of his past failures with an act of genuine grace. Or maybe he was just a lonely old fool who'd found a dying dog and couldn't bear to let her go. Time would tell, he supposed. Time always did. For now it was enough that she was alive and growing stronger each day. It was enough that someone needed him again, trusted him again, looked at him with affection instead of accusation. The questions of right and wrong, of ownership and obligation, could wait. Belle settled beside him with a contented sigh, her head resting on his boot. The silver collar weighed heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of the choice he'd have to make. But not today. Today, it was enough simply to sit by the fire with a faithful companion and pretend that redemption might still be possible for a man who'd lost everything in the world below. The wanted poster had been nailed to a pine tree near the old mining trail, for so long that the edges had curled and the ink had faded to a pale brown. Elijah hadn't seen it in years, had deliberately avoided that particular path because of what it represented. But Belle, growing stronger by the day, had insisted on exploring during their morning walk, her nose leading them down forgotten trails with the determination of a creature rediscovering her love of life. She'd been the one to find it, actually sniffing at the base of the tree where wind-blown leaves had gathered. When Elijah looked up to see what had caught her attention, his own face stared back at him from the weathered paper, though the man in the crude sketch looked harder somehow, more desperate than the reflection he saw these days in the still water of mountain streams. 500 reward, the poster proclaimed in bold letters, for information leading to the capture of Dr. Elijah Kane, wanted for criminal negligence in the death of Emily Hart. Last seen departing Millbrook Township, January 1886. Approach with caution. Criminal negligence. The words still had the power to stop his breath, even after all these years. He remembered the day they'd served him with the warrant, how Sheriff Patterson had looked everywhere but his eyes while reading the charges. The sheriff had known it was politics more than justice. Silas Hart's grief and influence demanding someone pay for his daughter's death. But the law was the law, and a prominent man's accusations carried weight that a disgraced doctor's protests could never match. Belle nudged his hand, sensing his distress. She'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read his moods, pressing close when the memories grew too heavy, offering her warm presence as an anchor to the present moment. Her recovery had been remarkable. Within a week of finding the collar, she was walking steadily, eating well, and showing the intelligent curiosity that marked her breed. Look at that. Girl, he said softly, gesturing to the poster. Your old friend Elijah Kane, wanted man. Bet you didn't know you were harboring a fugitive. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man accused of killing Silas Hart's daughter, nursing back to health the same man's beloved dog. If there was justice in the world, it had a cruel sense of humor. He'd been a good doctor once, he reminded himself as they continued their walk. Before the accusations, before the fear and doubt had crept into his hands during surgery. He'd studied at Johns Hopkins, trained under some of the finest physicians on the East Coast. His practice in Millbrook had been small but respected, serving ranch families and miners with equal dedication. The skills were still there, buried under years of disuse, but not forgotten. He could see it in how he'd cared for Belle, the careful assessment of her condition, the methodical treatment of her injuries, the patient monitoring of her recovery. His hands remembered what his heart had tried to forget. Belle had been his patient in the truest sense, and he'd healed her, not with the sophisticated tools and medicines of his former practice, but with the fundamental principles that had drawn him to medicine in the first place: observation, compassion, and the simple determination to ease suffering wherever he found it. During those first terrible days after Emily Hart's death, he'd replayed every moment of that night countless times. Had he missed something? Made the wrong choice? Been too slow to act? The questions had eaten at him like acid, destroying his confidence along with his reputation. But caring for Belle had reminded him of a truth he'd forgotten. Sometimes healing happened despite a doctor's limitations, not because of his skill. They'd been walking for nearly an hour when Belle suddenly stopped, her body going rigid with attention. Her ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in her chest. Elijah followed her gaze down the slope toward the main trail and felt his stomach drop. 3 riders were making their way up the mountain path, moving with the purposeful pace of men on serious business. Even at this distance, he could see the glint of badges on their vests and the careful way they scanned the landscape around them. Lawmen, most likely, though whether they were following his cold trail or pursuing some other business was impossible to say. Easy. "Girl," he whispered, dropping to one knee beside Belle. "Let's just watch for a minute." The riders paused at a fork in the trail, and Elijah saw one of them pull out what looked like a piece of paper, possibly a map, or maybe another copy of that faded wanted poster. They seemed to be having a discussion, pointing up toward the higher elevations where his cabin lay, hidden among the granite outcroppings. Belle's growl deepened, and he realized she was reacting not to the men themselves, but to something else entirely. Her nose was working, sampling the air currents that flowed down from the peaks. Border collies had been bred for intelligence and instinct, and both were telling her that strangers meant potential danger to her small pack of 2. "You're right to be cautious," Elijah murmured, stroking her head. "But let's not borrow trouble." They watched until the riders moved on, taking the eastern fork that would lead them toward the abandoned mining camps, rather than up to the hidden valleys where Elijah had built his refuge. Still, their presence was unsettling. In 7 years of exile, he'd seen perhaps a dozen people in these mountains, and most of those had been lost hunters or prospectors who'd wandered too far from the established trails. The walk back to the cabin was subdued, both man and dog alert to every sound in the forest around them. Belle, who'd been playful and curious on the way out, now moved with the focused attention of a creature preparing for threat. Her border collie instincts were fully engaged, and Elijah found himself grateful for her vigilance. Back at the cabin, he made his decision. The wanted poster had reminded him of realities he'd been trying to ignore, and the presence of lawmen in the area, coincidence or not, suggested that his time of peaceful anonymity might be coming to an end. If he was going to make a choice about Belle's future, about his own future, he needed to do it soon. He pulled the silver collar from its hiding place in his pack and studied it again in the afternoon light. The engraving seemed to mock him. "For my darling Emily, with all my love. Papa." A father's gift to a daughter who'd died because her doctor hadn't been skilled enough, quick enough, or blessed enough by Providence to save her. But Belle had lived. Under his care, with his knowledge and patience, she'd recovered from injuries and starvation that might have killed her. Didn't that count for something? Didn't that prove he still had the power to heal, to nurture, to do good in the world? The argument felt hollow even as he made it. Healing a dog wasn't the same as saving a child. Success with an animal patient didn't erase his failure with a human one. The collar in his hands was proof of both his shame and his hubris. He'd saved the pet while failing the owner, rescued the beloved companion while letting the beloved daughter slip away. Belle padded over to where he sat and laid her head on his knee, those mismatched eyes looking up at him with complete trust. She had no knowledge of his internal struggle, no understanding of the guilt that weighed on his shoulders like a physical burden. To her, he was simply the man who'd found her dying and brought her back to life. The man who shared his food and his warmth and asked nothing in return but companionship. "What would Emily think?" he asked her softly. "If she could see us now, what would she want us to do?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable but important nonetheless. Emily Hart had been 8 years old when she died, old enough to love her dog with the fierce loyalty that only children could manage. She'd probably trained Belle herself, taught her to sit and stay and come when called. The bond between them would have been profound and innocent, unmarked by the complexities that shadowed adult relationships. Would that little girl want her beloved pet to live with the man who'd failed to save her? Or would she want Belle returned to her grieving father, to the ranch that had been their shared home? The answer seemed obvious when framed that way, but Elijah found himself reluctant to accept its implications. As evening approached, he prepared Belle's dinner with the same careful attention he'd given to her medical care. She was eating well now, her coat glossy and her energy restored. In another week or two, she'd be fully recovered, ready to tackle the mountain trails with the enthusiasm of her breed. She'd also be strong enough to make the journey down to the Hart Ranch, if that's what he decided was right. The wanted poster had changed something, though he wasn't sure exactly what. Maybe it was the reminder that his past would always be part of his present, that he couldn't escape the consequences of his failures simply by hiding in the mountains. Or maybe it was the realization that Belle deserved better than a fugitive's uncertain future. Either way, time was running short for decision-making. The law might not be actively hunting him after all these years, but his presence in the mountains wasn't as secret as he'd believed. And Belle, sweet, trusting Belle, was living proof of his connection to the Hart family, evidence that could complicate his life in ways he didn't want to contemplate. As he watched her settle down for the night, curled up on the wool blanket that had become her bed, Elijah felt the weight of choice pressing down on him like the approaching winter. Tomorrow, or the day after, or sometime soon, he'd have to decide between his own desperate need for companionship and the moral certainty that Belle belonged with her rightful owner, but not tonight. Tonight, it was enough to sit by the fire and listen to her peaceful breathing, to pretend for a few more hours that redemption might be as simple as saving one dying creature in a world full of suffering. The hand-carved wooden cross stood barely 2 feet tall, weathered and simple, planted in a small clearing where wildflowers bloomed between scattered granite stones. Elijah had made it during his second winter in the mountains, when the isolation and guilt had nearly driven him to follow the same path as the man he'd buried beneath it. Thomas McKenna had been a prospector, old and worn down by years of chasing dreams that glittered just out of reach. Elijah had found him collapsed on the trail, clutching his chest and gasping for breath that wouldn't come. By the time he'd gotten the old man back to his cabin, it was already too late. Another life slipping away, despite his desperate efforts to save it. But this time had been different. This time there'd been no accusations, no angry family members demanding answers he didn't have. Thomas had died peacefully, holding Elijah's hand and whispering thanks for the kindness of a stranger. It had been the first good death Elijah had witnessed since becoming a doctor, and it had nearly broken him with its grace. He'd carved the cross from a piece of pine struck by lightning, working through the long winter nights when sleep wouldn't come. Each cut of his knife had been a prayer of sorts, a plea for understanding and forgiveness that he'd never been able to voice aloud. When spring came, he'd carried it to this peaceful clearing and planted it over Thomas's grave, hoping that somehow the gesture might bring peace to them both. Now, nearly 5 years later, Belle stood beside him at the weathered marker, her head tilted as if she could sense the significance of this place. She'd been growing stronger every day, but more than that, she'd been growing closer to him. The bond between them had deepened from gratitude into something approaching love, the simple, uncomplicated affection that dogs offered so freely and humans found so difficult to accept. "This is where I learned something important," Elijah told her, his voice soft in the mountain stillness, "about dying well and what it means to try." The cross had become his place of reflection over the years, somewhere he came when the weight of his past threatened to crush what remained of his spirit. Thomas McKenna had been the first person to die under his care without leaving him feeling like a failure. The old prospector had simply been ready, worn out by life, and content to slip away with a friend holding his hand. It had taken Elijah months to understand the difference. With Emily Hart, he'd fought against death with all the skill and desperation he possessed, refusing to accept that sometimes medicine had limits. With Thomas, he'd simply tried to make the passage easier, offering comfort instead of futile heroics. Both patients had died, but only one death had taught him about grace. Belle wandered among the wildflowers, sniffing at columbines and Indian paintbrush with the absorbed attention of a creature discovering the world anew. Her recovery had been remarkable, not just physically but emotionally. The haunted look that had marked her when he'd first found her was gone, replaced by the bright curiosity that seemed natural to her breed. Watching her explore, Elijah felt a familiar tightness in his chest. She was thriving under his care, becoming the dog she was meant to be. But she wasn't truly his, no matter how much he'd begun to think of her that way. The silver collar hidden in his cabin was constant proof of that uncomfortable truth. He'd been having dreams lately, vivid and disturbing visions that left him wakeful in the hours before dawn. In them, little Emily Hart played in a sunlit meadow with a young border collie puppy, both of them laughing with the pure joy that only children and animals seem to possess. Sometimes Silas Hart was there too, younger and happier, watching his daughter with the proud affection of a devoted father. The dreams always ended the same way, with Elijah arriving too late, his medical bag heavy in his hand as he watched the joy fade from the scene like morning mist. He'd wake with tears on his cheeks and Belle pressed against his side, her warm presence the only thing that kept the guilt from drowning him completely. "I reckon I'm being selfish," he said aloud, his words carrying across the clearing to where Belle had found something interesting among the rocks. "Keeping you when I know you belong somewhere else." She looked up at the sound of his voice, those remarkable mismatched eyes bright with intelligence. Then she abandoned whatever had caught her attention and trotted back to his side, settling beside him with the easy familiarity of a creature who'd found her place in the world. But that was just it. She had found her place, or seemed to think she had. With him, in this harsh but beautiful country, living simply and without complication. She showed no signs of missing her previous life, no restless searching for something lost. If anything, she seemed content in a way that suggested she'd found exactly what she needed. The thought brought him both comfort and fresh guilt. What if she was happy here because she'd been unhappy before? What if her previous life, for all its luxury and comfort, had lacked something essential that she'd found in his simple cabin? Or was he just telling himself pretty lies to justify keeping what wasn't his to keep? The cross stood silent before them, offering no answers but somehow managing to provide a sense of peace nonetheless. Thomas McKenna had taught him that sometimes the best thing a man could do was simply be present during life's difficult moments. Maybe that was what Belle needed now, not complex moral calculations about ownership and obligation, but simply someone who cared enough to pay attention to her needs, and her needs seemed simple enough. Food, shelter, companionship, and the freedom to explore this mountain world with curious nose and eager paws. Elijah could provide all of that, had been providing it without thought or reservation. The question was whether providing for her physical needs was enough to justify keeping her from whatever emotional needs might be met by returning to her original home. The afternoon was growing late, and the mountain air carried the crisp hint of evening. They'd walked farther than usual today, Belle's increasing strength allowing them to explore trails that had been beyond her reach just a week ago. Soon they'd need to start back to the cabin, to the simple routines that had become their shared life. But for now, Elijah was content to sit beside the cross and watch Belle investigate every interesting scent the clearing had to offer. Her joy was infectious, reminding him of pleasures he'd forgotten during his years of solitude. The way sunlight looked filtering through pine needles, the sound of water moving over stones, the simple satisfaction of a companion who asked nothing more than presence and kindness. "You know what, girl?" he said, as she returned to his side again. "Maybe the answer isn't about what's right or wrong. Maybe it's about what serves love best." The idea felt revolutionary, though he knew it was probably obvious to anyone who hadn't spent 7 years wrestling with guilt and self-recrimination. Love didn't always follow the neat lines of law and ownership. Sometimes it meant holding on, and sometimes it meant letting go. The trick was knowing which choice honored the love rather than the lover. Belle leaned against his leg, her weight warm and solid. She was fully recovered now, strong enough for whatever journey lay ahead. Strong enough to return to her original home if that's what love demanded, but also strong enough to build a new life if that's what love offered. The cross stood witness to his struggle, carved from lightning-struck wood and planted in soil where wildflowers bloomed. It had been meant as a marker of death, but sitting here with Belle beside him, Elijah began to think it might serve just as well as a symbol of resurrection, of second chances and new beginnings, of the possibility that even broken things could be made whole again, given enough time and care. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they finally started the walk back to the cabin. Belle ranged ahead and circled back, her movements confident and joyful. She was no longer the dying creature he'd found beside the trail, but a vibrant, intelligent animal in her prime. Whatever decision he made about her future, he could take pride in that transformation. The cross grew smaller behind them as they climbed toward home, but its message seemed to follow them up the mountain. Sometimes the greatest act of faith was simply believing that love could find a way, even when the path seemed impossible to navigate. Sometimes grace came not through grand gestures, but through the patient accumulation of small kindnesses, offered without expectation of reward. Tonight, he would sit by the fire, with Belle curled beside him, and try to understand what love was asking of him. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would know what answer to give. But for now, it was enough to walk the mountain, trail with a faithful companion, and trust that the right choice would reveal itself when the time came to make it. The wooden cross stood guard over its peaceful clearing as darkness settled over the mountains, a silent reminder that some questions could only be answered by the heart. The gold pocket watch had stopped at 11:47. And Silas Hart had never bothered to wind it again. It sat heavy in his vest pocket as he stood on the wide porch of his ranch house, watching the dust cloud raised by another group of returning riders, empty-handed like all the others. 3 months of searching, countless dollars spent on rewards and hired men, and still no sign of Belle. He pulled the watch from his pocket and stared at its frozen face, remembering the moment time had stopped for him as well. 11:47 on the night of October 15th, when Dr. Elijah Kane had emerged from the surgery room and spoken the words that shattered Silas's world. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hart, there was nothing more I could do." Emily had been everything to him, his late wife's final gift, the light that had kept him going through the dark years after consumption took Margaret. An 8-year-old whirlwind of laughter and questions, riding beside him as he checked the herds, helping in her earnest way with the ranch books, chattering endlessly about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, so she could help all the animals on the ranch, and Belle had been her constant companion from the moment Silas brought the puppy home for her 6th birthday. He'd paid a fortune to have the dog shipped from a breeder in Scotland, wanting only the best for his darling girl. The silver collar had been commissioned specially, engraved with love and presented on another birthday that now felt like a lifetime ago. The ranch house felt like a mausoleum these days, its rooms echoing with memories that brought more pain than comfort. Emily's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it that final morning, her books stacked on the nightstand, her clothes folded in the dresser, her hairbrush still holding strands of golden silk that caught the light when he forced himself to enter the room. But it was Belle's absence that made the silence unbearable. The dog had been Emily's shadow, sleeping curled at the foot of her bed, following her through the house and barns with devoted attention. After the accident, after the funeral, Belle had seemed to understand that her world had changed irrevocably. She'd taken to wandering the ranch, searching for her young mistress with heartbreaking persistence. Then, 3 months ago, Belle had simply vanished. No trace, no trail, no explanation. Just gone, like the last living connection to his daughter had been severed by some cruel fate. The ranch hands had searched for weeks before Silas began hiring professional trackers, posting rewards in every town within 100 miles, sending men into the mountains and across the prairie in an ever-widening circle of desperation. Mr. Hart. The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, his foreman for the past 15 years. A steady man with weathered hands and patient eyes, Jake had been with the ranch since before Emily was born. He'd loved the little girl like his own granddaughter, and Belle's disappearance had hit him almost as hard as it had Silas. "Any luck?" Silas asked, though he could read the answer in Jake's expression. Patterson and his boys checked the old mining camps up towards Silver Creek, found some evidence of recent activity, campfires, maybe someone living rough up there, but no sign of Belle. Could be prospectors, could be drifters. Hard to say. Silas nodded, his fingers closing around the watch. He'd sent men to every possible location, followed every rumor and report. Someone had claimed to see a dog matching Belle's description near the railhead at Miller's Crossing. Another report had placed her in a mining camp 50 miles north. All had proven false, leading his searchers on futile chases across empty country. "There's something else," Jake continued, his voice careful. "That wanted poster you had printed up, the one for Dr. Kane. Billy found pieces of it nailed to a tree up on the old mining trail. Looked like it had been there for years, but someone had been by recently. Ground was disturbed, like maybe someone had stopped to read it. The news sent a chill through Silas that had nothing to do with the evening air. He'd had those posters printed during the worst of his grief, when rage had seemed easier to bear than sorrow. Criminal negligence charges against the doctor who'd failed to save Emily, a bounty posted for information about his whereabouts. It'd been politics more than justice, his influence used to create consequences where none had existed legally. "Could be coincidence," Jake offered gently. "Lots of folks travel that trail. Could be anyone, but Silas knew better. In 7 years, no one had reported seeing hide nor hair of Dr. Elijah Kane. The man had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him, which had suited Silas fine. Part of him had hoped the disgraced doctor had done the decent thing and put himself out of the misery he'd caused. But if Kane was still alive, still hiding somewhere in the mountains, double the reward, Silas said suddenly. Both of them. 5,000 for Belle, 5,000 for Kane. Jake's eyebrows rose. That's a lot of money, boss. Might attract the wrong kind of attention. I want them found. The words came out harder than he'd intended, carrying all the weight of 3 months of fruitless searching and 7 years of unresolved grief. "Oh, whatever it takes, however much it costs. I want them both found." He turned and walked back into the house, leaving Jake to organize the new search efforts. The hallway was lined with photographs. Emily at 2, pigtails flying as she ran through the barn. Emily at 5, solemn and proud in her first riding outfit. Emily at 7, grinning gap-toothed as she held a prize-winning calf at the county fair. And in nearly every picture, Belle was there too, growing from gangly puppy to devoted companion. The study was his refuge these days, the one room in the house that held no memories of Emily's laughter. He'd spent countless hours here since her death, managing the ranch business that had once brought him satisfaction, but now felt merely like going through motions. The Hart Ranch was one of the largest cattle operations in 3 counties, built through 2 generations of backbreaking work and careful investment. But without Emily to inherit it, without her dreams to fund and her future to secure, the empire felt as hollow as its owner. He pulled out the bottle of bourbon he kept in the desk drawer and poured himself 3 fingers. The liquor burned going down, but it dulled the sharp edges of his grief just enough to make the evening bearable. He'd been drinking more lately. Not enough to affect his work, but enough to notice. Jake had started giving him concerned looks, and the household staff moved around him with the careful consideration usually reserved for dangerous animals. The truth was, he was dangerous, to himself if not to others. The rage that had sustained him through the first years after Emily's death was fading, leaving behind an emptiness that threatened to swallow him whole. Belle had been his anchor to something beyond mere survival, the last living thing that had loved his daughter as much as he had. Without her, Without that connection to Emily's memory, he wasn't sure what kept him tied to the world of the living. The pocket watch ticked once, a mechanical hiccup that startled him. For a moment he thought time might start again, that the hands might begin their steady march toward an uncertain future. But the moment passed and the watch fell silent again, frozen at 11:47 forever. He finished his bourbon and poured another, staring out the window at the vast expanse of his holdings. Thousands of acres of prime grazing land, herds of cattle that represented more wealth than most men saw in a lifetime, a house that had once been filled with love and laughter, all of it meaningless without the people who'd made it matter. But Belle was still out there somewhere. Lost, maybe injured, possibly dead, but somewhere. And Dr. Elijah Kane was out there too, hiding from the consequences of his failure like the coward he was. If Silas could find them both, if he could bring Belle home and make Kane face what he'd done, maybe then he could find some kind of peace. The watch grew heavy in his pocket as the evening deepened into night. 11:47, the moment his world had ended. But somewhere out in the darkness, his search continued. Men with rifles and determination, following trails that might lead to answers. Money talks loud in country where cash is scarce, and $5,000 would buy a lot of motivation. He'd find them both, no matter how long it took or what it cost. Belle, because she was all he had left of Emily, and Kane, because some debts could only be paid in full through a reckoning that was 7 years overdue. The house settled around him with the sounds of old wood and older grief. Tomorrow would bring fresh reports, new leads to follow, more riders heading out with his gold and his desperate hope. But tonight, he sat alone with his bourbon and his broken watch, counting the cost of love and the price of loss in a world that had taken too much and given too little in return. Outside, the wind carried the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the endless business of the ranch continuing regardless of one man's sorrow. Life went on, even when time stood still. But Silas Hart had stopped caring about life the night his daughter died. Now he cared only about finding the last pieces of her world and bringing them home where they belonged. The child's brush set sat on the windowsill of Emily's bedroom, exactly where she'd left it that final morning. 3 brushes of different sizes, their silver handles tarnished now, but still bearing the delicate engravings of roses and ribbons that had delighted an 8-year-old girl. Silas had commissioned them from the same craftsman who'd made Belle's collar, wanting Emily to have something special for grooming her beloved companion. He stood in the doorway of her room, bourbon glass in hand, unable to cross the threshold, but unwilling to leave. The afternoon light, streaming through the lace curtains, illuminated dust motes dancing in the still air, tiny specks of life in a space that had been frozen in time for 7 years. Everything was exactly as Emily had left it. Her favorite dress laid out for a church social she'd never attend, her books stacked beside the bed, with a ribbon marking her place in Black Beauty, her porcelain doll sitting primly in the rocking chair. But it was the brushes that drew his gaze, as they always did. He could still see Emily sitting cross-legged on the bed, Belle patient and trusting beside her as small hands worked carefully through the dog's coat. She'd been so serious about it, so determined to make Belle beautiful for whatever adventure the day might hold. The larger brush for the initial grooming, the medium one for working out tangles, the smallest for the delicate fur around Belle's face and ears. "Papa, look how pretty she is." Emily's voice echoed across the years, bright with pride and love. She'd hold up the brushes like a surgeon displaying instruments, explaining her technique with the gravity that only children could bring to matters of ultimate importance. "Belle likes the little brush best. It tickles, and she gets happy when I use it." The memory was so vivid that Silas almost stepped into the room, almost called out to the ghost of his daughter. But the moment passed, leaving him alone with his grief and the terrible weight of all the conversations they'd never have. All the brushing sessions that would never happen. All the love that had nowhere to go but inward, where it curdled into something dark and desperate. Jake found him there an hour later, still standing in the doorway like a sentinel guarding a tomb. "Boss." The foreman's voice was gentle, careful. Got a report from the team checking the northern passes. Thought you'd want to hear it. Silas didn't turn around, couldn't tear his gaze away from those silver brushes, catching the last of the afternoon light. What did they find? Tracks, recent ones. Dog tracks that match the size we're looking for, heading up toward the high country. Could be Belle, could be another dog. But the prints are fresh, maybe 2-3 days old. Now Silas did turn, hope flaring in his chest like a struck match. Where exactly? Trail junction near Dry Creek. The tracks head up toward Eagle's Rest, following the old game trails. Rough country up there, but if someone was trying to stay hidden, send more men. The words came out sharp, commanding. I want every trail in that area searched. Every cabin, every cave, every place a man might hide. Jake nodded, but didn't move to leave. Boss, there's something else. The tracks weren't alone. Human footprints alongside them, like maybe someone was walking with the dog. Someone who knows the country well enough to travel those high trails. The implication hung in the air between them. If Belle was alive, if she was with someone in the high country, it raised questions that Silas wasn't sure he wanted answered. Had she been stolen? Had someone found her and kept her, not knowing about the reward? Or worse, had someone taken her deliberately, knowing exactly whose dog she was and what her return might mean? I'll lead the search myself, Silas said, already moving toward the stairs. Sir, with respect, those are hard trails. Dangerous country for someone who hasn't been riding the high passes regular-like. Maybe it's better to let the boys... It's my dog. The words came out harder than he'd intended, carrying all the weight of 3 months of fruitless searching and 7 years of accumulated grief. It's my daughter's dog, and I'll be the one to bring her home. He left Jake standing in the hallway and headed for his study, mind already racing with plans. He'd need supplies for a week in the mountains, maybe longer. Cold weather gear, since the high country could turn brutal without warning, even in late summer. His rifle, in case they encountered the wrong kind of wildlife or the wrong kind of people. The thought of Belle alive, somewhere in those peaks, filled him with an energy he hadn't felt in months. She was out there, had to be. The alternative, that she died alone and afraid, far from the home where she belonged, was too terrible to contemplate. Emily had loved that dog with the pure, uncomplicated devotion that only children could manage. And Belle had returned that love with the loyalty that defined her breed. He pulled maps from his desk drawer, spreading them across the leather surface. The area around Eagle's Rest was marked with elevation lines that showed the brutal terrain. High alpine meadows, accessible only by narrow trails. Granite peaks that challenged even experienced climbers. And hidden valleys where a man could disappear completely if he knew what he was doing. The kind of country where a fugitive might choose to hide. The kind of place Dr. Elijah Kane might have fled after destroying Silas's life. The thought struck him like a physical blow. What if the tracks belonged to Belle because she was with Kane? What if the man who'd killed his daughter had been living in the mountains all these years, keeping the one thing that might have brought Silas comfort? The possibility was so monstrous, so perfectly cruel, that it felt like something fate might devise as the ultimate test of a man's sanity. He reached for the bourbon bottle, his hands shaking slightly. The idea was probably just grief and desperation talking, his mind creating connections where none existed. But the timing was suspicious. The old wanted poster discovered just before fresh tracks appeared in the same general area. If Kane was hiding up there, if he'd found Belle or taken her, the brush set seemed to mock him from Emily's room, visible through the open doorway. He could imagine Kane using them, grooming Belle with instruments meant for a little girl's gentle hands. The violation of that image, the corruption of Emily's innocent love, made his chest tight with rage, but rage was better than despair. Rage gave him purpose, direction, something to do with the energy that had nowhere else to go. If Kane had Belle, if the coward who'd failed to save Emily was now keeping her last companion from coming home, then Silas would track him down and make him pay for every day of stolen comfort. He began making lists, supplies, weapons, men he could trust to follow him into the high country. The ranch could run itself for a while. Jake was more than capable of handling the day-to-day operations. What mattered now was bringing Belle home, and if that meant confronting the ghost of Dr. Elijah Kane, so be it. The pocket watch felt heavier than usual as he checked the time, still stopped at 11:47, still marking the moment his world had ended. But maybe if he could find Belle, if he could bring her back to the house where she belonged, time might start moving again. Maybe the terrible stillness that had defined his life since Emily's death might finally give way to something resembling peace. The brushes caught the last rays of sunlight as evening approached, silver gleaming like hope in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow he'd ride into the mountains, following tracks that might lead to Belle or might lead to nothing. But for the first time in months, he felt like a man with a mission, instead of a man just marking time until death claimed him too. Belle was out there somewhere, and he was going to bring her home. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, however many ghosts he had to face along the way. Emily deserved that much from the father who'd failed to protect her. Belle deserved that much from the man who'd promised to love and care for her always. The silver brushes waited on the windowsill, ready to restore a faithful companion to the beauty and dignity she'd known in happier days. Ready to fulfill their purpose in hands that remembered how to love, even if they'd forgotten how to hope. Soon, Silas told himself, pouring another bourbon as darkness settled over the ranch. Very soon, those brushes would have work to do again. The faded photograph slipped from between the pages of Elijah's old medical journal like a ghost made manifest. He'd been searching for something, anything, that might help him understand what was right to do about Belle, some fragment of his former medical training that might guide his conscience. Instead, he found himself staring at a face he'd tried for 7 years to forget. Emily Hart smiled up at him from the sepia-toned image, her golden curls caught in mid-bounce as she laughed at something beyond the camera's frame. She wore a white dress with lace at the collar, and her arms were wrapped around the neck of a border collie puppy. Belle, young and gangly, all oversized paws and bright eyes. But it wasn't the sight of Emily, or even the young Belle, that made Elijah's hands shake as he held the photograph. It was himself, standing behind them in his finest suit, stethoscope draped around his neck like a badge of honor. Dr. Elijah Kane, respected physician, pillar of the community, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed he could heal whatever ailments the world might present. The photograph had been taken at the church social. He remembered now the annual fundraiser for the new hospital wing, where prominent families gathered to celebrate their contributions to the community's welfare. He'd forgotten that Silas Hart had insisted on the photograph, proclaiming his gratitude for the doctor who delivered Emily safely through a bout of scarlet fever the previous winter. "The man who saved my daughter's life," Silas had announced to anyone who would listen, his arm draped proudly around Elijah's shoulders. "We owe him everything." The irony was so complete, so devastating, that Elijah felt his knees give way. He sank into his rough-hewn chair, the photograph trembling in his fingers like a leaf in a storm. He'd saved Emily once, only to fail her when it mattered most. He'd been the hero of her story before becoming its villain, the trusted friend who'd let her slip away into darkness when she needed him most. Belle, as if sensing his distress, padded over from her place by the fire and pressed her muzzle against his knee. Those mismatched eyes, one brown, one blue, looked up at him with the same intelligence and trust he remembered from the puppy in the photograph. She'd grown into the beautiful, devoted companion that little Emily had loved so completely, the living reminder of a child's pure affection. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "What have I done?" The memories came flooding back with brutal clarity. The church social where this photograph was taken, how Emily had chattered endlessly about her new puppy, how she'd made him promise to visit Belle whenever he came to check on the ranch hands. The way she'd looked at him with absolute trust, the same expression Belle wore now, the faith of innocence in someone who seemed capable of making everything right. He'd kept that promise too, in the months before the accident. Regular visits to the Hart Ranch, supposedly to check on the workers' health, but really to see Emily's delight in her growing companion. He'd taught her how to check Belle's ears for infection, how to brush her coat properly, how to recognize signs of illness or injury. Emily had absorbed every lesson with the serious attention of a child who'd found her calling. "I'm going to be a veterinarian like you're a people doctor," she'd announced one autumn afternoon. Belle sprawled contentedly in her lap as she practiced the brushing techniques he'd shown her. "Belle and I will help all the animals on the ranch, and Papa will be so proud." The photograph showed the moment when that dream still seemed possible, when Emily's future stretched ahead bright with promise, and Belle was just beginning to grow into the devoted companion she'd become. Before the storm, before the fall, before the terrible night when all of Elijah's skill couldn't save the child who'd trusted him completely. He remembered now the way Silas had looked at him across Emily's still form, the gradual shift from desperate hope to dawning horror as he realized his daughter was truly gone. The accusations had come later, fueled by grief and the need to blame someone for the unthinkable. But in that first moment, there had been only shared devastation. Two men who'd loved Emily in their different ways, united in their failure to protect her. Belle's gentle whine drew him back to the present. She was watching him with concern, her head tilted in that characteristic way that meant she was trying to understand what had upset her human. How much did she remember of her previous life? Did she ever think about the little girl who'd loved her first, who'd taught her to sit and stay and come with the patient repetition of someone who had all the time in the world? The photograph showed Emily's hands tangled in Belle's puppy fur, both of them radiating the kind of joy that only comes from perfect, uncomplicated love. That little girl had trusted Elijah with her most precious possession, had brought Belle to him for every small concern, every minor scrape that needed tending. And he'd failed them both on the night when trust mattered most. "She loved you so much," he told Belle, his voice thick with unshed tears. "More than anything in the world except maybe her father. And I," the words stuck in his throat, too terrible to voice aloud. But Belle seemed to understand anyway. She rose and placed her front paws on his knees, stretching up to lick the tears from his cheeks with the gentle persistence of a creature offering comfort. It was the same gesture Emily had trained her to perform when someone was sad, a trick that had delighted visitors to the Hart Ranch. The recognition of Emily's training in Belle's gentle response broke something in Elijah's chest. This wasn't just Silas Hart's dog. This was Emily's companion, shaped by a child's love and patient instruction. Every mannerism, every endearing habit, every sign of intelligence and devotion could be traced back to the little girl who'd poured her heart into raising the perfect friend. And he'd kept her from the man who was all that remained of Emily's world. Not maliciously, perhaps, but selfishly. He'd been so focused on his own need for companionship, his own desperate hunger for something to love and be loved by, that he'd ignored the greater claim of the man who'd lost everything. The photograph seemed to mock him from where it lay in his lap, a testament to happier times when he'd been worthy of trust and respect. Dr. Elijah Kane, savior and friend, the man who'd earned a place in the Hart family's most treasured memories, before he'd become the coward who'd fled rather than face the consequences of his failure. Belle settled back on her haunches, but kept her paws on his knees, those remarkable eyes never leaving his face. She was beautiful in her maturity, everything Emily had dreamed she would become. Strong and intelligent and devoted, a credit to the child who'd shaped her earliest months with such loving care. "I have to take you home," he said finally, the words coming out like a physical wound. "I have to take you back to him, don't I?" Belle's tail wagged once, a tentative movement that might have been agreement or simple response to the gentle tone of his voice. She couldn't know what he was saying, couldn't understand the choice that was tearing him apart. To her, he was simply the man who'd saved her life and cared for her with patience and kindness. The idea of leaving him, of returning to a previous life she might not even remember clearly, was beyond her comprehension. But the photograph in his lap told a different story. It spoke of bonds that predated his claim to her affection, of love that had been interrupted by tragedy but never truly severed. Emily Hart's dog belonged with Emily Hart's father, in the home they'd shared, and the memories they'd made together. The decision felt like cutting away a piece of his soul. But Elijah knew it was the only choice that honored the love shown in the faded photograph. Belle wasn't his to keep, no matter how much joy she'd brought to his lonely mountain existence. She was the last living link between Silas Hart and his daughter, the only creature left who'd shared Emily's daily life and received her boundless affection. He tucked the photograph carefully back into the medical journal, but its image was burned into his memory now. Emily's laughing face, Belle's puppy enthusiasm, and his own younger self, confident and hopeful, still believing that healing was always possible for those with skill and dedication enough to attempt it. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey down the mountain. He would face Silas Hart's rage and grief, would offer whatever explanation or apology might be accepted. But most importantly, he would return Belle to the place where she belonged, where Emily's memory lived on in every room and every cherished possession. It was the very least he could do for the child whose trust he'd betrayed, whose life he'd failed to save. Belle would go home to the father who'd loved her and the little girl who'd trained her to be the perfect companion. And Elijah would return to his mountain solitude, carrying only the knowledge that he'd finally done something right in a world where his failures had cost so much. The photograph waited in the journal's pages, a window to a time when hope still seemed possible and love hadn't yet learned the bitter taste of loss. But love had its own demands, its own moral imperatives. Sometimes it meant holding on, and sometimes it meant letting go tomorrow. It would mean walking down a mountain trail with the most precious thing he'd ever found, and giving her back to the man who'd lost everything else. The handwritten letter lay on Elijah's crude wooden table, like a confession waiting for judgment. 3 attempts he'd made at writing it. 3 times he'd crumpled the pages and thrown them into the fire, watching his words turn to ash and smoke. But this 4th try felt different somehow, heavier with truth. It waited with the kind of honesty that could only come from a man who'd run out of places to hide. "Mr. Hart," it began, his careful script looking strange after years of writing nothing more than supply lists and weather observations. "By the time you read this letter, Belle will be home where she belongs. I know that nothing I can say will undo the harm I've caused your family. But I hope you will allow me to explain how I came to have her, and why I kept her as long as I did." Belle lay beside the fireplace, her head resting on her paws as she watched him work. She seemed to sense that something significant was happening, that the quiet routine of their mountain life was about to change in ways she couldn't understand. Her meals had been smaller lately, not from lack of food, but because nervous energy had stolen Elijah's appetite, and he'd found himself sharing even less than usual. The letter continued for 3 pages, each word chosen with the care of a man who knew they might be his last chance to make peace with the past. He wrote about finding Belle near death, about the agonizing discovery of her collar, about the terrible recognition that fate had brought him, the one creature who could force him to confront his failures. He wrote about his years in exile, about the guilt that had driven him from civilized society, about the slow healing that Belle's presence had brought to his wounded spirit. But mostly, he wrote about Emily. "I think about her every day," the letter confessed. "About her laughter when Belle performed the tricks she'd taught her. About the way she used to bring the dog to my office for the smallest concerns. About how proud she was to be learning to care for animals the way I cared for people. She trusted me completely, Mr. Hart. That little girl believed I could fix anything, heal anyone, make everything right with the world. I have lived these 7 years knowing that I betrayed that trust in the moment when it mattered most." The words blurred as he wrote them, tears falling onto the paper and smearing the ink slightly. But he pressed on, determined to say everything that needed saying before courage failed him. He wrote about the night Emily died, about every decision he'd made and every technique he'd tried. He wrote about the limitations of medical knowledge, about the cruel randomness that sometimes claimed young lives despite the best efforts of those who fought to save them. "I know you believe I killed your daughter through negligence or incompetence," he continued. "I know the law agrees with you, and I know that fleeing rather than facing trial made me look guilty of everything you accused me of. But I need you to know that I loved Emily too in my way. She was the brightest, kindest child I ever had the privilege to treat, and losing her nearly destroyed me as completely as it destroyed you." The confession took most of the morning to complete. When he finally signed his name at the bottom, his hand was cramped and his heart felt lighter than it had in years. The truth was out now, committed to paper where it couldn't be taken back or modified. Whatever Silas Hart chose to do with that truth was beyond Elijah's control. He sealed the letter in an envelope he'd fashioned from brown paper, then tucked it into Belle's collar, where it would be found when he delivered her to the Hart ranch. The journey would take 2 days through the mountain passes, assuming the weather held and his aging joints could manage the steep trails. He'd need to pack carefully, enough food for both of them, warm clothes for the cold nights, and his few precious possessions in case he never returned to the cabin. The afternoon was spent in preparation, sorting through his meager belongings with the methodical care of a man who might not get another chance to set his affairs in order. His grandfather's straight razor went into the pack, along with the medical journal containing Emily's photograph. The worn leather satchel that had carried everything he owned for 7 years would make the journey one last time. Though he suspected it might not be coming back, Belle watched these preparations with growing anxiety, her intelligent eyes tracking every movement as he packed and repacked his supplies. Dogs understood routine better than most humans, and the disruption of their settled patterns clearly worried her. She followed him around the cabin, staying close enough to touch, as if physical contact might prevent whatever change she sensed approaching. "It's going to be all right, girl," he told her, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "We're going on a journey, that's all. Just you and me, walking down the mountain to where you belong." But she wasn't fooled by his reassuring tone. Belle had been abandoned once before, left to die on a mountain trail for reasons she couldn't understand. The prospect of another upheaval in her life clearly frightened her, and Elijah felt his heart break a little more each time she pressed against his legs or whined softly for attention. As evening approached, he made their final meal in the mountain cabin, rabbit stew with wild onions and the last of his stored vegetables. Belle ate with less enthusiasm than usual, her appetite diminished by the same nervous energy that had been affecting them both. She kept looking toward the door as if expecting someone to arrive, some threat or change that would explain the tension in the air. After dinner, Elijah sat by the fire with Belle curled against his side, her warm weight both comfort and torment. Tomorrow they would begin the journey that would separate them forever, that would return her to her rightful owner and leave him to face whatever consequences awaited. The thought of the empty cabin, of the silence that would replace her gentle breathing and contented sighs, was almost unbearable. "You know," he said softly, his fingers working through her soft fur, "I've been thinking about what Emily would want, about what she'd say if she could see us now." Belle's ears pricked forward at the sound of her former mistress's name, though Elijah wasn't sure if she actually remembered Emily or was simply responding to his tone. 7 years was a long time in a dog's life, and she'd been little more than a puppy when tragedy struck the Hart family. "I think she'd want you to be happy," he continued, "to be loved and cared for, to have a home where you belong. I think she'd want her father to have you back, to have that connection to her memory. And I think," his voice broke slightly, "I think she'd forgive me for keeping you this long, for being selfish when I should have been strong." The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. In a few hours, he'd bank the coals, and they'd sleep their last night together in the simple bed he'd built with his own hands. Tomorrow would bring the painful walk down the mountain, each step taking them closer to a reunion that would end the most meaningful relationship of his exile. But tonight, he could hold her close and pretend for a few more hours that she was his to keep. Tonight, he could listen to her breathing and feel her heartbeat against his ribs, and imagine that redemption might be as simple as loving something well enough to let it go. The letter waited in Belle's collar, his confession sealed and ready for delivery. The pack sat by the door, loaded with everything they'd need for the journey. The cabin felt smaller somehow, as if it was already shrinking back to the empty shell it had been before Belle's arrival brought it to life. "Tomorrow we go home, girl," he whispered into her fur. "We take you home where you belong, and I face whatever comes after. But tonight we have this. Tonight we have each other." Belle sighed and settled deeper against his side, trusting and content despite the changes she could sense approaching. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would transform both their lives, that the journey down the mountain would lead to confrontations that had been 7 years in the making. For now, it was enough to sit by the fire with a faithful companion and gather strength for the hardest thing he'd ever had to do. The handwritten letter contained his confession, but the real truth was simpler and more painful than any words could express. Sometimes love meant walking away. Sometimes the greatest act of devotion was learning when to let go. The loaded revolver felt heavy in Silas Hart's hand as he crested the ridge and saw the smoke rising from the hidden valley below. 3 days of hard riding through treacherous mountain passes had led him here, following tracks that his best tracker swore belonged to Belle. Now, as he looked down at the crude cabin nestled against a granite outcropping, his heart hammered with a mixture of hope and rage that made his vision blur at the edges. There, in the small clearing beside the cabin, a black and white border collie raised her head and looked directly at him. Even at this distance, even after 3 months of desperate searching, he knew that silhouette, as well as he knew his own reflection. Belle, alive, alert, and apparently healthy. The relief that flooded through him was so intense it nearly knocked him from his saddle, but the relief curdled quickly into something darker when he saw the man emerge from the cabin. Tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in the harsh mountain sun. The face was older, more lined than Silas remembered, but there was no mistaking those features. Dr. Elijah Kane stood in the doorway of his hiding place, one hand resting on Belle's head in a gesture of casual familiarity that made Silas's blood boil. 7 years. 7 years of hiding like a coward, while Silas had lived with the agony of his daughter's death and the fresh torture of Belle's disappearance. 7 years of letting a grieving father believe he'd lost everything that mattered. While Kane played house with the last living connection to Emily's memory, Silas dismounted carefully, his hand never leaving the grip of his Colt .45. The weapon had been his father's, carried through cattle wars and range disputes, passed down with the admonition that some problems could only be solved with iron and lead. Today felt like one of those times. Belle's ears perked forward as she caught his scent on the mountain breeze. For a moment, Silas thought she might recognize him, might come running with the joyful enthusiasm he remembered from their last meeting. But she stayed close to Kane's side, looking between the two men with the cautious attention of an animal sensing tension. "Hello, Silas," Kane's voice carried across the clearing, rough with disuse but steady. "I've been expecting you." The casual greeting, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee instead of a wronged man confronting his daughter's killer, sent rage coursing through Silas like liquid fire. He strode forward, the revolver now openly visible at his side. "Have you now?" Silas's voice came out harder than he'd intended, carrying 7 years of accumulated grief and fury. "Been expecting me while you played with my daughter's dog? While you let me think she was dead?" Kane stepped away from the cabin doorway, moving into the open where Silas could see him clearly. The years had been hard on the former doctor. His clothes were patched and worn, his face lined with weather and what might have been guilt. But his eyes were steady as they met Silas's furious gaze. "She was dying when I found her," Cain said quietly. "Half-starved, injured, ready to give up. I saved her life after you killed my daughter." The words came out like bullets, sharp and deadly. "After you let Emily die on your table, you think saving her dog makes up for anything?" Belle whined softly, her body language tense as she picked up on the hostility crackling between the two men. She looked back and forth between them, clearly torn between her gratitude to Cain and some deeper memory that Silas's voice and scent might be triggering. "Nothing makes up for Emily's death," Cain replied, his voice heavy with a pain that seemed genuine. "Nothing I could do or say or sacrifice would bring her back. But I couldn't let Belle die too. Not when I had the power to save her." Silas raised the revolver, not quite pointing it at Cain, but making his intentions clear. "You had the power to save my daughter too. You had the skill, the knowledge, the responsibility. And you failed her when she needed you most, yes." The simple acknowledgement seemed to surprise Silas. He'd expected denials, excuses, the kind of medical double-talk that had infuriated him during those terrible days after Emily's death. Instead, Cain stood straight and met his eyes without flinching.
"Yes, I failed her."
"I failed you. I failed everyone who trusted me to be better than I was." The honesty in Cain's voice threw Silas off balance. For 7 years, he'd imagined this confrontation, had pictured the coward who'd fled justice cowering and making excuses. But the man standing before him seemed almost relieved to finally face his accuser, as if this moment had been inevitable since the night he'd run away. "She trusted you," Silas said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "Emily believed you could fix anything, heal anyone. She used to tell me about the visits when you'd check on Belle, how you'd teach her about animal care. She wanted to be a veterinarian because of you." Cain's composure cracked at that, pain flickering across his weathered features. "I know, I remember. She was so bright, so eager to learn. I should have—" He stopped, shaking his head. "There are no excuses, Silas. I did everything I knew how to do that night, but it wasn't enough." "It will never be enough." Belle took a tentative step forward, her nose working as she caught more of Silas's familiar scent. Recognition dawned in her mismatched eyes, and her tail gave a single, uncertain wag. The gesture was like a knife to Silas's heart, his daughter's beloved companion, torn between the man who'd saved her life and the family she'd once belonged to. "Come here, girl," Silas said softly, lowering the gun slightly. "Come to me, Belle." She hesitated, looking back at Cain with something that might have been confusion or apology. The bond between them was obvious. Months of shared meals and mountain walks had created a connection that wouldn't be easily broken. But deeper memories stirred as well, recognition of a voice that had once called her name with love and pride. Cain knelt down and whispered something in Belle's ear, his hand gentle on her head. Whatever he said seemed to release her from obligation because she padded slowly toward Silas, her approach cautious but deliberate. When she was close enough to touch, Silas holstered the revolver and dropped to one knee. Belle sniffed his outstretched hand, her tail wagging with increasing enthusiasm as she recognized the scent of home. Then she was pressing against him, her solid warmth familiar despite the months apart. And Silas felt something inside his chest crack open. "There's my girl," he whispered, his voice thick with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in months. "There's my beautiful girl. I thought I'd lost you forever." Belle licked his face with the enthusiastic affection he remembered, her entire body wiggling with joy at their reunion. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the grieving man and the faithful dog, connected by shared love for a little girl who would never come home. But when he looked up, Cain was still there, still waiting with the patient resignation of a man who'd accepted his fate. The revolver was heavy against Silas's hip, a reminder of the justice that had been 7 years delayed. "Why didn't you bring her back?" Silas asked, rising to his feet with Belle pressed against his legs. "Why keep her when you knew what she meant to me?" Cain was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Because I'm a selfish man, he said finally. Because she was the first thing that made me feel useful since Emily died. Because I was too much of a coward to face you and admit what I'd done. The honesty was brutal in its simplicity. No excuses, no justifications, just the raw truth of a man who'd chosen his own comfort over another's grief. Silas felt his hand drift back toward the revolver. 7 years of rage, demanding satisfaction. But Belle looked up at him with those trusting eyes, and he hesitated. She was alive, healthy, obviously well cared for, despite the circumstances. Whatever else Kane had done, whatever crimes he'd committed, he'd saved this one precious thing when death would have been easier to accept. There's something else, Kane said quietly, reaching into his pocket. Something you need to know before you decide what to do with me. He pulled out an envelope, weathered and sealed, and held it out towards Silas. Belle's collar, Silas realized, had been removed and the envelope must have been tucked inside it. What is it? Silas asked, though part of him already knew. The truth, Kane replied. About that night. About what really happened when Emily died. About why I ran, and why I stayed hidden all these years. The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. Inside it were answers to questions that had tormented Silas for 7 years. Explanations that might finally make sense of the tragedy that had destroyed his world. But holding it also meant facing the possibility that his rage had been misdirected, that his need for someone to blame had blinded him to more complex truths. The revolver waited at his side, ready to deliver the justice he'd dreamed of for so long. Belle pressed closer against his legs, a warm reminder of what they'd both already lost and found again. Belle's gentle touch broke through the wall of rage that had sustained Silas' heart for 7 long years. As he stood frozen with the unopened letter in his hand and murder in his heart, she moved between the two men with the instinctive wisdom that only animals seem to possess. Her warm muzzle pressed against his trembling fingers. Then she turned and nudged Kane's hand with the same gentle insistence, the simple gesture, comfort, offered to both grieving men without judgment or taking sides, shattered something fundamental in Silas's chest. The revolver fell from his nerveless fingers, landing in the mountain dirt with a dull thud that seemed to echo across the clearing like a thunderclap. She knows, Kane said softly, his voice breaking on the words. She knows we're both broken by the same loss. Silas sank to his knees, the letter crumpling in his fist, as 7 years of accumulated grief finally overwhelmed the rage that had been holding it at bay. The sobs came from somewhere deep inside, a place he'd locked away the night Emily died, and once they started, they wouldn't stop. I loved her, he choked out between gasping breaths. She was everything to me. Everything good in this world, and I couldn't protect her. I couldn't save her. Kane knelt across from him, Belle between them like a bridge, spanning the chasm of their shared pain. Neither could I, he whispered. God help me, Silas, neither could I. The words hung in the mountain air between them, 2 confessions of failure that somehow felt lighter for being shared. Silas looked up through his tears and saw his own anguish reflected in Kane's weathered face. Not the cold indifference he'd imagined all these years, but raw, unhealed wounds that had never stopped bleeding. Tell me, Silas said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Tell me what happened that night. Tell me why my little girl had to die. Kane's hands shook as he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. The storm had been going for hours when you brought her in. She was unconscious, had been since the fall. Head trauma, severe swelling of the brain. I knew, his voice broke. I knew from the moment I saw her that the damage was catastrophic. Belle settled between them, her warm presence anchoring both men to the present moment, even as they relived the worst night of their lives. I tried everything, Kane continued. Every technique I'd learned, every procedure that might reduce the pressure in her skull. I worked through the night, refusing to give up, refusing to accept that sometimes medicine has limits. But the swelling was too severe, the damage too extensive. Silas closed his eyes, remembering his own vigil in the waiting room, pacing the floor and praying to a God who seemed to have stopped listening. When you came out of that room, When you told me she was gone, I wanted to kill you with my bare hands. I know. I saw it in your eyes and I understood it. I wanted to kill myself. Cain's confession was raw with pain that had never diminished. She trusted me, Silas. That beautiful little girl looked at me like I could work miracles, and I failed her when she needed me most. The letter lay forgotten between them as both men confronted the truth they'd been avoiding for 7 years. Emily's death hadn't been caused by negligence or incompetence or any of the accusations that had driven Cain into exile. It had been caused by the cruel randomness of fate, by the simple fact that sometimes bad things happen to good people despite everyone's best efforts to prevent them. The charges, Silas began, but Cain cut him off with a shake of his head, were justified. Maybe not legally, but morally. I was responsible for her care, and she died under my watch. The fact that I did everything possible doesn't change the outcome. Belle whined softly, sensing the pain radiating from both men. She moved closer to Silas, offering her warmth and presence to the man who'd been her first family. Then she stretched her neck to nuzzle Cain's hand, refusing to abandon the person who'd saved her life. "She's trying to tell us something," Silas said, watching the dog's patient ministrations. "About forgiveness, maybe. About not letting grief poison everything we touch." Cain's laugh was bitter and broken. Emily would have understood. She always saw the best in everyone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. She used to tell me that Belle was going to be a therapy dog when she grew up, that she had a gift for making sad people feel better. The memory hit Silas like a physical blow. He could see Emily so clearly, 8 years old and wise beyond her years, explaining her plans for Belle's future with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. She'd been right in her way. Belle had become exactly what Emily envisioned, a creature whose love transcended human complications and offered healing to broken souls. "I kept her because I was selfish," Cain admitted, his hand gentle on Belle's head, "because she was the only thing left in the world that connected me to Emily, to the man I used to be before I failed her. I told myself I was protecting her, giving her a good life, but really, I was just too much of a coward to give her back to you. Maybe," Silas said slowly, "maybe she needed both of us. Maybe she needed to save your life so she could come home to me." The idea felt revolutionary. The possibility that Belle's journey from death back to life and home again had served a purpose neither man could have understood at the time. She'd been dying when Cain found her, abandoned and alone just like he was. Saving her had reminded him of his capacity for healing, had given him a reason to keep living when guilt threatened to destroy him. And now she was home, bringing with her the possibility of forgiveness and understanding between two men united by loss. "Emily loved us both," Silas continued, his voice growing stronger. "She loved you for the doctor you were, for the way you cared about people and animals. And she loved me for being her father, for giving her Belle and a home where she felt safe." Maybe he swallowed hard. Maybe she'd want us to stop hurting each other over something that was never anyone's fault. Cain looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in 7 years. "Do you really believe that?" Silas looked down at Belle, who was watching both men with those remarkable mismatched eyes. One brown, one blue, like she could see the world from 2 different perspectives and somehow make sense of both. Emily's dog, trained by a child's love to offer comfort to anyone who needed it. "I believe," Silas said carefully, "that holding on to anger has nearly killed us both. I believe that Emily would want Belle to be happy and healthy, whether that's with you or with me, or somehow with both of us. And I believe," his voice cracked again, "I believe that 7 years is long enough to carry guilt that belongs to fate, not to any man." The sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the mountain clearing. Belle rose and walked to the cabin door, then looked back at both men as if inviting them inside. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a bridge between past and future, between the pain they'd carried and the possibility of healing they might find together. Cain stood first, then offered his hand to help Silas to his feet. The handshake was tentative at first, then grew firm as two broken men found strength in shared understanding. "Come inside," Kane said quietly. "Let me tell you about these past months with Belle. Let me tell you how much she still remembers Emily, how much love she has left to give." Silas nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. The revolver lay forgotten in the dirt, its weight no longer needed to prop up a rage that had finally burned itself out. In its place was something fragile, but real, the possibility that two men might find peace in, honoring the memory of the child they'd both loved and lost. The shared campfire crackled between them as darkness settled over the mountain clearing, its warm light dancing across two faces that had aged beyond their years, but somehow looked younger in the gentle glow. Silas Hart sat across from Elijah Kane, Belle stretched contentedly between them, her head resting on Silas's boot, while her tail occasionally thumped against Elijah's leg. It was a picture of peace that neither man could have imagined when the sun rose that morning. They'd spent the evening talking, really talking, for the first time since the night Emily died. Elijah had shown Silas the simple cabin where Belle had recovered, the careful improvements he'd made for her comfort, the trails they'd walked together during her healing. Silas had shared stories of the desperate search, the sleepless nights, the way Belle's absence had nearly finished what Emily's death had started. But mostly, they'd talked about Emily herself, about her laughter and her dreams, her stubborn kindness and her absolute faith that the world was fundamentally good. They'd shared memories that had been too painful to speak aloud for 7 years, finding that grief divided was somehow more bearable than grief carried alone. "She used to practice veterinary procedures on her dolls," Silas said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Lined them up on her bed like patients, and explained to Belle exactly what she was doing and why. Said she learned it all from watching you work." Elijah smiled, the expression soft with remembered affection. She had the touch for it too. Gentle hands, patient temperament. Animals trusted her instinctively, the way they trusted Belle. "I always thought—" He stopped, shaking his head. "What?" "I always thought she'd make a better doctor than I ever was. She had something I had to learn, the understanding that healing isn't about conquering death, but about serving life as fully as possible." Belle stretched and yawned, then padded over to Elijah for a moment of attention before returning to her place by the fire. The easy affection between them was obvious, but so was her growing reattachment to Silas. She seemed to understand, in the way that animals sometimes do, that she belonged to both men now in different but equally important ways. "I've been thinking," Silas said carefully, "about what happens next. About what Emily would want for all of us." Elijah waited, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with accusation and guilt. "I think she'd want Belle to be happy," Silas continued. "To have a life full of love and purpose, not locked away on a ranch with a bitter old man who's forgotten how to live." "You're not bitter," Elijah said quietly. "Grieving, yes. Hurt beyond measure, but not bitter. I've seen bitter, Silas. I've been bitter. You're just a father who lost his child and didn't know how to find his way back to the light." The words hung in the mountain air between them, simple and true. Silas felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of self-recrimination that had been choking him for years. "What I'm saying is," he went on, "maybe Belle doesn't have to choose. Maybe she could spend part of her time at the ranch and part of her time up here with you. God knows these mountains agree with her, and you—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You brought her back to life, Elijah. That has to count for something." Elijah looked up sharply, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "You'd be willing to share her, after everything I've done." "After everything we've both done," Silas corrected. "After all the pain we've caused each other and ourselves. Yes, I think I would. I think Emily would want that." They talked through the details as the fire burned lower, working out an arrangement that felt right to both men. Belle would spend the warm months in the mountains with Elijah, helping him with his simple life and keeping him connected to the world of the living. When winter came, she'd return to the ranch with Silas, where she could run free across the prairie and remind him daily that love didn't die with the beloved. "There's something else," Elijah said, as they prepared to bank the fire for the night. "I was a doctor once, a good one before fear made me cautious and guilt made me useless. These mountains are full of people who need medical care, trappers, prospectors, folks who can't afford the trip to town when they're hurt or sick." Silas nodded slowly, understanding. "You want to practice again. I want to serve again. To use what I know in honor of Emily's memory instead of hiding from it. Belle could help. She has a gift for comforting people, for making them feel safe. Emily trained her well. The idea felt right in a way that surprised them both. Dr. Elijah Kane, mountain healer, serving the forgotten people of the high country with a faithful border collie at his side. It wasn't the grand practice he'd once maintained in town, but it was honest work that honored both his skills and Emily's dreams. "I could help," Silas offered. "Supplies, medicines, whatever you need. The ranch does well enough to support that kind of work." They shook hands on it there by the dying fire, two men who'd found purpose in their shared loss and hope in their unexpected friendship. Belle watched them with those remarkable mismatched eyes, her tail thumping approval of whatever agreement they'd reached. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the pine needles like scattered diamonds. They broke their fast together, sharing simple food and easy conversation like old friends rather than former enemies. Belle ranged around the clearing, full of energy and joy, as if she could sense that the long shadow hanging over her life had finally lifted. When it came time to leave, Elijah packed his few belongings with the same care he'd used 7 years earlier, but this time the weight felt different. He wasn't fleeing in shame, but stepping forward into a future that held purpose and companionship, and the possibility of redemption through service. The ride down the mountain was peaceful, Belle ranging ahead and circling back with the enthusiasm of a dog on adventure. Silas and Elijah rode side by side, talking easily about practical matters, the medical supplies that would be needed, the best ways to reach isolated settlements, how to let people know that help was available for those who needed it. At the fork in the trail where their paths would diverge, Silas toward his ranch, Elijah toward his new life as a traveling healer, they stopped to make their final arrangements. "She'll be happy with you," Silas said, watching Belle investigate something interesting in the brush. "And in the spring, when she comes back to the ranch, she'll have stories to tell. Stories Emily would have loved," Elijah agreed. "Adventures and healing, and the kind of useful life she always dreamed of for her dog." They embraced then, briefly but sincerely, two men who'd found their way through grief to something resembling peace. Belle bounded over to join them, pressing against both sets of legs, as if sealing their new bond with her approval. "Give my regards to Jake and the boys," Elijah said as they prepared to part ways. "Tell them Dr. Kane is back in business, just with a different kind of practice." Silas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "They'll be glad to hear it. Some of them remember when you delivered their children before—" He stopped, then continued more gently. "Before life got complicated for all of us." They went their separate ways then, Belle trotting alongside Elijah as they headed toward the first settlement where his new work would begin. But the separation didn't feel final anymore, just temporary. Come spring, they'd all be together again, sharing the stories of another year lived in Emily's honor. The campfire that had brought them together was just ashes now, but its warmth had kindled something more lasting. Friendship forged in shared sorrow and tempered by mutual forgiveness. Belle had been the bridge between them, but the connection they'd built would endure long after her faithful heart finally stilled. In the end, it wasn't about who owned whom or who deserved what. It was about love, finding a way to heal even the deepest wounds, about second chances earned through service, and about the simple truth that some bonds transcend the circumstances that create them. Emily Hart would have been proud of them all, the father who learned to love again, the doctor who found his calling in the wilderness, and the faithful dog who brought them together when they needed each other most. The mountains would remember their story, told in the whisper of wind, through pine boughs, and the gentle wisdom of creatures who understood that love, properly tended, could indeed conquer all.